Everyone knows the M14 and the M16. They are weapons that, to a greater or lesser extent, changed the history of armament both in the United States and the world. Both were standard rifles of the United States Army, but if you look closely, there is a very strange jump in the designation of both weapons. It jumped from 14 to 16. Or at least that's what people think, since in fact there was an M15 and nobody remembers it. It practically didn't last in service due to many shortcomings and the bureaucracy of its creator country. In this video, we will see the curious history of the standardization of American rifles during the 50s and 60s. And in turn, you will discover what the M15 was and why it disappeared. So get comfortable, my name is Kevin Aguilar and this is Guns Club. To understand how we got to the M15, we have to go back a bit in time. After World War II, all the powers were transitioning their outdated weapons of war to more cutting-edge weapons, better adapted to the new battlefields. But these changes were not being made in order to offer the best firepower, for example, but rather in order to have good logistics. The United States and the Soviet Union realized the enormous logistical headache of having many types of ammunition for various weapons, making the distribution and creation of supplies for the soldiers and weapons much more complex. So on the part of the nascent NATO, the 7.62 by 51 NATO was standardized. A somewhat large cartridge, but with this, the same machine gun ammunition could be used for rifles. So with just one type of ammunition, you could feed all your weapons, except for the pistols. It was all a logistical wonder. But this also created many other problems, especially for the introduction of new assault rifles, which seemed to be the future at that time. The 7.62 by 52 cartridge was too powerful for an automatic rifle, so it was problematic to design an assault rifle with those characteristics. The Soviets did the same as NATO, but with a somewhat different approach. Almost all Soviet rifles and infantry machine guns used the 7.62 by 39. This cartridge was made with the intention that it could be used as intermediate and machine gun ammunition, which allowed to optimize logistics. And in addition, that the Soviets could develop effective assault rifles before NATO. By 47, the Americans knew the need to provide automatic weapons like assault rifles, just as the Soviets did, since the Army had the M1 Garand as the standard rifle, which was already a bit outdated. In the Korean War, the Americans used the automatic M2 carbine, which served the role of an assault rifle. This used the .30 carving and left much to be desired. So in 52, a competition began among a bunch of weapons that wanted to become the standard American rifle. The T-48, the T-47, and the T-44. The T-48 was an American version of the Fabrique Nationale Fusil Automatique Léger, while the T-48 and 44 were local developments based on the M1. The test showed the Fabrique Nationale Fusil Automatique Léger slightly outperformed the Garand with very close results. However, in the end, the winner was the T-44 because it was a bit simpler than the Fusil Automatique Léger. According to Springfield Armory, it could be produced using the existing M1 Garand manufacturing infrastructure, which turned out to be not so true. After the test, the T-44 was designated as the M14 and was adopted in 57 as the standard rifle of the armed forces. During its development, its counterpart, the M15, was created, which was technically the same weapon as the M14. But its intention was to be better equipped to be used as the Browning bar. It had a reinforced barrel for sustained fire, a reinforced stock to withstand the huge recoil, a strange hinge that anchored to your shoulder, and a bipod for prone firing. Later on, we will talk about its curious fate. The EME-14 and EME-15 in general were large rifles. They were as reliable as they were accurate. They were the very definition of versatility. Besides replacing the M1 Garand, these also phased out the M3, M1 carbine, and M2, and the Browning bar definitely, so this weapon fulfilled the role of 4 weapons in one. However, there was a great conflict in the Department of Defense. 2 factions were formed, the progressives, who rejected the M14 and asked for a rifle of smaller caliber that had polymers, and the more conservative ones who wanted an American weapon, and above all, of large caliber. These latter would win this battle, so the 60s would come, and with them, the Vietnam War. By the time the conflict started, all the soldiers already had their M14s, but the first years of war were really horrible for the soldiers. As you might guess, the M14Es were definitely not suitable for modern warfare, at least not as assault rifles. In the jungles of Vietnam, the walnut wood that made up the structure of the weapon would swell with moisture, reducing its integrity and causing it to crack, just from using the rifle. It was long and heavy and uncomfortable to use in the jungle, and the main problem was, of course, its cartridge. This weapon had a fire selector with semi-automatic and automatic mode. The problem was that, as you can guess, firing in automatic mode with precision was practically impossible. The recoil was too much for a rifle, so the soldiers used the weapon in semi-automatic mode. Always, although the cartridge was enough to shatter moderately thick trees. Even so, the soldiers basically seemed to have M1 Garands to face enemies with AKMS, RPDS, and rocket-propelled grenade 7-say. This was complete, utter madness. To solve these problems, they tried to introduce polymers to the stock, but these came too late. American casualties in '68 were alarming, and something had to be done. A few years ago, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, had authorized the assessment of AR-15 rifles to have them compete against the M14s, despite the proven superiority of the Armalite rifle 15. In all aspects, the decision was made to standardize the M14 anyway. It's unclear exactly why this controversial decision was made, but most likely the old-fashioned American high command saw weapons with polymers as poor-quality plastic products and perceived the intermediate caliber as weak. The bigger the projectile, the better, right? Well, as we said in '68, the problem with this controversial decision was costing many lives. How was it possible that a country like North Vietnam had better weapons than the greatest military power of that time? So McNamara decided to standardize the M16 and suspended all orders for M14. The soldiers, however, were initially not satisfied with the M16. They called it Mattel toys, as they were made of plastic, and the acceptance of polymers was initially difficult, despite their terrible initial adaptation. By the '70s, they had almost completely replaced the M14s. As for the M15s, they had limited participation at the beginning of the conflict. But the soldiers found that their improvements were the same as having an M14, normal with a bipod, so it was never mass-produced. This became the M14E2, which in turn became the M1401. However, it still couldn't serve as a light machine gun as anticipated. They even tried to manufacture M16s with bipods to fulfill this function. But in the end, the role of the light machine gun would be taken by the M60, which, although it had certain weight problems, was a better weapon for close infantry support. Yes, the M15 existed but didn't have the chance to shine, and for this reason it was forgotten by both the American Army and popular culture. It's curious how the United States was afraid to innovate. It was almost 30 years behind the Soviets in rifle development, and they couldn't catch up until the '80s, with the development of the R-15 derivatives. I think this is a good reflection. Stepping out of our comfort zone can be tough as the performance of the first M16. But in the end, all this sacrifice always brings us good things. If you are interested in this video, you might be interested in this one about a versus of the American and German grenade from World War II. Which one was better? I highly recommend it. Thank you very much for this video, and see you in the next one. Goodbye.